Yesterday, it was a headline on a screen. Today, it is a receipt in your hand. In the last 24 hours, the world watched missiles arc across the Middle East, watched governments talk in the language of retaliation, and watched the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow throat the oil market depends on, move from geopolitical risk to immediate threat. Overnight, crude didn't just rise, it jumped like a heart rate on a monitor when the alarm finally becomes real. And in New York, in the language of trading desks and television panels, some people are already calling it a Texas boom. That phrase tells you everything about who this story is for and who it is not. Because for families waking up in Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, and the vast space in between, this is not a boom. It is the beginning of an economic event that feels like a natural disaster, even though it is man-made. It starts at the gas pump. It starts with a commute that turns into a crisis. It starts with the kind of quiet arithmetic working people do without calling it economics. The calculation of miles, dollars, hours, groceries, rent, and the thin margin between we're okay and we're not. Texas is a state that sells power to the world. Power from oil fields, from refineries, from pipelines, from ports, from the endless industrial engine that runs along the Gulf Coast. And yet, for millions of Texans, daily life is built on a fragile assumption that fuel will be available and that the price will remain within the range a normal paycheck can absorb. That assumption is what war breaks first. This is a documentary about the economic fallout in Texas following the sudden 2026 war with Iran. It is urgent, it is technical, and it is not as simple as oil goes up, Texas wins. Because even if some companies in Texas make record money, the average Texan will experience this as a multi-front squeeze. Transportation costs exploding, supply chains convulsing, grocery prices surging, infrastructure facing cyber risk, and the Federal Reserve cornered into doing the one thing that would crush what is left of affordability. If you want the truth in one sentence, it is this. In a modern, car-dependent state, a war-driven oil shock is not a boom. It is a regressive tax, a supply chain shock, and a financial stress test hitting households and small businesses all at once. Now, let's begin where most Texans will meet this crisis, the line at the station. This morning, the first images weren't from foreign capitals, they were from local intersections. Cars stacked into the street, trucks idling, people staring at digital signs like the numbers might change if they glare hard enough. Some stations already rationing by policy or by consequence, card readers down, supply uncertain, crowds tense. And here is the part Wall Street analysts don't live inside. Texas is not a place where you can simply choose not to drive. You can't take the train from most suburbs. You can't just bike 30 miles along frontage roads in heat through interchanges designed like concrete rivers. You can't keep your job in a logistics warehouse out of town, or on a construction site, or in a hospital on the far side of a metro area if you can't reliably show up. A gas shock in Texas is not an inconvenience. It is a mobility crisis. And mobility is income. So when prices surge, it behaves like the most brutal kind of tax. Not a progressive one, not one scaled to ability to pay, a flat pane applied per mile. The wealthier you are, the less your life changes. You fill the tank and complain. You keep going. Maybe you switch to a more efficient vehicle. Maybe you absorb it as temporary. The poorer you are, the more your life breaks immediately. Because fuel is not a luxury input. It is the input that lets you earn the money that pays everything else. This is why the phrase $8 a gallon matters even before it becomes universal. Even if that number only appears in certain pockets, even if it spikes during the first wave of panic and scarcity, the psychological effect is the same. It tells households the floor has moved. And when the floor moves, everything shifts with it.
The working-class Texan who drives a truck because they haul tools, because they have a family, because they bought what was available, is suddenly paying hundreds more per month just to keep moving. The suburban service worker who drives 40 minutes each way because the rent near the job is impossible is suddenly buying less food to buy more fuel. The gig worker whose income is literally miles is suddenly bleeding profit with every trip. The small contractor, the landscaper, the independent repair crew, people who are the invisible skeleton of a functioning city, are suddenly paying war prices for the right to work. And the cruelest part is that this hits fast. It hits before anyone has time to adjust. It hits before employers change schedules. It hits before anyone can move closer to work because leases don't move at the speed of missiles. It hits before households can refinance debt or restructure because the banks are not built to help you when the problem is that the world changed overnight. Now listen carefully how this plays out in real life. First, people try to maintain normal. They keep commuting, they keep errands, they keep the routine, but they cut the margin. No extra trips, no visiting family, no driving for pleasure. The state becomes smaller in a week because movement becomes expensive. Second, missed payments start. Not because Texans forgot how to work, because the fuel bill arrives weekly and it has no sympathy. If you don't pay it, you don't move. If you don't move, you don't get paid. Third, the jobs begin to wobble. Employers see lateness, no-shows, turnover. Some businesses adapt, others punish. The labor market tightens not because demand vanished, but because the ability to physically show up became more expensive than the wage justified. And then, as if the pump shock weren't enough, the second wave arrives. Diesel. Because diesel is the blood that moves everything into Texas, across Texas, and out of Texas. Wall Street loves to talk about crude. Households live inside refined products. And trucking runs on diesel. Warehouses run on diesel. Backup generators run on diesel. Agriculture runs on diesel. Construction runs on diesel. Emergency response runs on diesel. When diesel surges, it doesn't just make driving expensive, it makes the state's supply chain wobble. Here is the simplest way to understand the grocery crisis. Grocery stores do not have weeks of food sitting in the back. They operate on a replenishment rhythm. Trucks arrive, shelves fill, consumers buy, inventory moves, the next truck arrives.
When the cost of moving goods spikes suddenly, that rhythm breaks in two ways. One, independent truckers and small carriers already living on tight margins can't make runs that lose money. If fuel eats the profit, you stop driving. Not because you're lazy, because you are not a charity. Your truck is your business, and your business cannot operate at a guaranteed loss. Two, large carriers keep driving, but they pass the cost along. That cost moves downstream into everything: the food itself, the packaging, the retail price, the delivery fee, the cold chain logistics. So within days, you see the effects on shelves. First wave, visible scarcity, not nationwide famine, but gaps, certain items missing, deliveries delayed, substitute brands, limit 2 per customer, that familiar language of panic economics. Second wave, visible price jumps. The signs change, the numbers climb. What used to be an ordinary grocery starts to feel like a luxury purchase. And here is where the cruelty compounds. The pump shock has already emptied wallets. Families have already spent the extra money just to get to work. Now, when they arrive at the grocery store, the price of food has risen too. This is how oil shocks become household crises. Transportation and food, 2 categories you cannot fully avoid, rise together. It is also how they become political crises, because people don't debate supply chains when their children are hungry. Now, let's talk about Texas specifically, because Texas has 2 roles in this. Texas is a consumer of fuel and goods like everyone else. Texas is also an energy engine, a refining hub,
a petrochemical complex, and a port state. That means Texas sits at the intersection of the shock and the profit. The same conflict that threatens to disrupt global shipping routes can also inflate revenues for certain parts of the Texas energy sector. And that is where the Texas boom narrative comes from: the Permian Basin, the refinery profits, the export margins, the trading gains. But that story is incomplete with the next layer: infrastructure risk. Because war in 2026 is not fought with missiles and jets, it is fought with code. If the United States is involved in an Iranian conflict, critical infrastructure becomes a target in a way that makes the phrase homeland less abstract. And in Texas, the target list writes itself: energy, ports, power, refineries, pipelines, and the logistics nodes that make the economy move. The Port of Houston is not just a local facility, it is a national artery. And we already know it has been in the crosshairs of sophisticated cyber actors in the past, with authorities describing a nation-state linked attack and warning about the potential to disrupt port operations. Now imagine the timing. A wartime oil shock is already tightening supply, raising prices, and stressing households. If a cyber attack hits port operations, delaying shipments, freezing systems, forcing manual processes, the supply chain shock intensifies instantly. The state doesn't get a week to prepare, it gets an hour to improvise. This is what fragility means in economic terms: a system that works beautifully when everything is normal and fails sharply when one critical node is disrupted. And there's a second node Texans understand in their bones: the grid, ERCOT. The Texas power grid is unusual. It's largely separate. It's managed by an operator that serves the overwhelming majority of the state's electric load, and it has become a symbol not only of Texas independence, but of Texas vulnerability. You don't need to be an engineer to feel what Texans already know. The grid can be dependable on normal days and terrifying during extremes.
Texas lived through Winter Storm Uri, when controlled outages were used to prevent a catastrophic cascading collapse. Now, combine that history with wartime panic. Cyber threats don't have to turn off Texas to cause chaos. In a stressed environment, small disruptions produce outsized effects. A successful intrusion that forces an operator to isolate systems, a malware event that triggers precautionary shutdowns, a coordinated disinformation campaign that causes people to rush stores and stations, a targeted strike on a refinery's IT that slows production. Even without a full blackout, the fear of a blackout changes behavior. People fill bathtubs, people buy generators, people rush for fuel again. And the fuel they rush for is now expensive because the war has already raised the price. This is how crises stack. Now let's talk about that too, because every crisis creates a market for exploitation. Price gouging, fake fuel alerts on social media, scams pretending to offer government war relief, predatory lending targeted at households desperate to cover a sudden gap, aggressive debt collection because companies know consumers are stretched and will default. The crisis does not come from abroad, it grows tendrils at home. Now here is what makes Texas uniquely vulnerable and uniquely contradictory in this moment. Texas is not one economy. It is multiple economies layered on top of each other. There's the energy economy, there's the tech economy, there's the service economy, there's the logistics economy. There's the rural economy that depends on driving and diesel and long distances. There's the border economy and the port economy. When oil rises, the energy economy celebrates, the service economy suffers, the logistics economy convulses, the rural economy bleeds. That is why the same headline can be called a boom by one person and a nightmare by another. And that brings us to the conclusion we have to be brave enough to say out loud. This war is going to create record winners and mass losers in Texas.
The energy executives and the companies positioned to sell into a high-priced market will do extraordinarily well. Some investors will call it genius. Some politicians will call it strength. But if you measure an economy by the ability of ordinary people to live ordinary lives, drive to work, buy groceries, keep the lights on, pay the mortgage, then what is coming is not prosperity. It is a transfer from the middle and working class to the top, a transfer disguised as market forces, a transfer accelerated by fear. And in the final irony, this transfer will be narrated as Texas winning, even as Texans are rationing gasoline, cutting meals, and falling behind. This is what two Texases looks like in wartime economics. One Texas is insulated. They have savings, they have efficient vehicles, they have remote work, they have premium health care, they have credit lines, they have assets that rise with inflation. They will complain, but they will be fine. The other Texas is exposed. They live paycheck to paycheck. They drive long distances. They rely on older vehicles that cost more to operate. They work jobs that cannot be done on Zoom. They are one surprise bill away from collections even in peacetime. In wartime, they become collateral damage of an economy that treats fuel as a consumer choice instead of an infrastructure dependency. So when you hear the phrase Texas boom in the next few days, ask a better question. Boom for whom? For the executive whose bonus rises with crude? For the nurse commuting across the city, paying war prices to keep showing up? For the refinery shareholders, or for the family in Dallas staring at a grocery receipt that doubled right after the gas bill doubled? For the trader watching charts, or for the independent trucker parked because the run is no longer profitable? For the suburb that can absorb it, or for the rural town where distance is not a lifestyle, it is reality? This is not just an economic story, it is a moral story told through numbers, because the numbers will not be evenly distributed, and the way this ends, whether it becomes a temporary shock or a long, grinding crisis, will depend on decisions made quickly, decisions about infrastructure security, price gouging enforcement, emergency logistics, support for households, and the courage to admit a simple truth. A car-dependent economy cannot survive a fuel shock without breaking people. And a society that measures success by corporate profit while families are collapsing is not a society that is truly winning. Yesterday, the war was breaking news. Today, it's at the pump. Tomorrow, it will be at the grocery store. And soon after that, it will be in the eviction notices, the repossession lots, the strained grids, and the silent fear that spreads when people realize the system they depend on is not built for this kind of stress. Texas has the wealth. Texas has the industry. Texas has the capacity. But in 2026, the question is not whether Texas can produce record profits. The question is whether Texas can protect its people from becoming the price of those profits.